Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm Ruben Maximiano of the Competition Division here at the OECD, and it's my pleasure to moderate the next two sessions of this competition open day of the OECD. And both of these two sessions are interrelated. We'll first have a keynote speech and Q&A with Professor Mariana Mazzucato, which you see next to me, and then a panel of heads of competition authorities from across the world. In these two sessions, we will look at the economic recovery and the role for competition policy following the COVID-19 induced recession. So Professor Mariana Mazzucato is a professor in economics of innovation and public value at the University College London, where she is founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's been awarded numerous international prizes, too many for me to mention now, and has made really a valuable contribution to advancing the frontiers of economic policy thinking. In that quest, she is the author of several books, including The Entrepreneurial State, that investigates the critical role the state plays in driving growth. And her most recent book is The Mission Economy, that is very relevant for our current debate on how to ensure sustainable economic recovery. A very interesting book indeed. But Mariana has also been active in the practical aspects of policymaking, as she has also acted as advisor to the OECD and to many governments and policymakers across the globe. So we have approximately 30 minutes. Professor Mazzucato will present for 15 minutes, and then there'll be opportunity for Q&A with Professor Mazzucato. So please do let us know your questions using the Q&A function in your application. So welcome to Paris, even if virtually, Mariana. It's a true pleasure and honor to have you here. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on the current circumstances and your views on how they require a different role for policymakers, different role for the state, and of course, since it's the competition open day, how that may interact somehow with competition policy. Anyway, you don't really want to hear from me. I think you want to hear from Professor Mazzucato. So let's jump right in. Mariana, you have the screen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm going to try to do exactly what you just suggested, which is to actually link two areas that unfortunately often aren't linked, which is how do we understand innovation-led growth? Growth that actually has a purpose, right? It's not innovation for innovation's sake. It's not growth for growth's sake. The idea is actually to direct growth towards an economy that's more inclusive and is more sustainable. And what's the relationship between that and how we understand competition? And, you know, just something, sort of an anecdote. I just want to start off with that because I think it's quite interesting. Many people, you know, think that Schumpeter wrote a lot about innovation and that creative destruction was his thing. Actually, Marx had already said all that. What Schumpeter talked about that was really original was competition. He argued that, you know, capitalism is actually characterized by firms that are trying to differentiate themselves through innovation. And that leads to constant differences between those firms. It leads to disequilibria. It leads to what he called, you know, creative destruction. And yet he said the standard theory of competition doesn't take any of that into account. To even introduce innovation, you have to talk about imperfect competition. And of course, our model of the benchmark perfect competition only looks at, say, differences between companies as a transient state towards a situation with representative agents, or disequilibria as a transient state towards equilibria. So that really deep insight, I think, that Schumpeter had, which unfortunately isn't addressed enough, which is that how we understand how the system evolves, how we understand how firms compete in modern capitalism has to then also be reflected in our underlying model of real competition itself. And we shouldn't have to talk about imperfect competition to talk about innovation-led differentiation. Anyway, I just think that's a really important first point to make, because unfortunately the conversations about entrepreneurship, innovation, technological change aren't always this, you know, in the same room as our conversations about competition. And if we bring them together, we will be able, I think, to better govern also innovation and markets in such a way that we actually get the kind of results that we want in terms of, again, inclusive, sustainable growth. So on that, let me just kind of go to the immediate point, which is that this particular moment that we're all living through is incredibly challenging in all sorts of different levels, but also in terms of innovation, in terms of production. It's just been so incredible how so many countries haven't been able to govern a process of even supplying something that's relatively basic, which is personal protection equipment to frontline workers. Obviously, the vaccine was much harder than that. And the good news, I actually got vaccinated today, by the way, this morning. The vaccine production itself has taken some time. It's being rolled out, but how do we govern vaccine production? How do we govern the innovation around the vaccine to actually meet what we need, which is the vaccine has to be universally accessible in order to work, because this is a global health pandemic, but also the test and trace system and so on. What I think it's really highlighted is the need for capacity, productive and innovation capacity on the ground. And of course, mute.
You're muted, yeah.
Was I muted the whole time?
No, just
oh my God, don't scare me like that. Okay. So the climate crisis, which, last February, before last March, when we all of a sudden all knew what COVID was, there was, not frontline workers in hospitals that we were looking at on the television screens, but, firefighters in Australia and California, flood workers in Venice. And what is really pretty tragic here too, in terms of capacity and transformative capacity on the ground, is we're simply not moving quick enough. The IPCC report told us we only had 10 years left, and yet just last year, we had huge amounts of subsidies in the EU, over $55 billion worth going to fossil fuel companies, and also a very high percentage of the COVID recovery funds have been revealed with some recent data to be going again to fossil fuel projects. So this is not good news in terms of actually moving at the speed that Greta and others are telling us that we should be moving when our house is on fire. You get out of the house, you don't sit there and debating what to do. And of course, we also have, since 2015, people sometimes forget, it's only 5 years ago, we have these 17 goals, very ambitious goals that every country has agreed on, 169 targets beneath them. But here too, if you look at all the different indicators, we are simply not moving fast enough. And all these goals require all sorts of innovation: technological change, organizational change, social innovation. And these are really wicked challenges that require also political, regulatory, and behavioral changes. But we need an investment pathway, an innovation trajectory to reach them, and unfortunately not moving fast enough. And the backdrop of this, and this is something I've been writing about for quite a long time, is that unfortunately we also have this very problematic view of what government is even for in the economy. And this is not unrelated to the fact that we're moving so slow on those different fronts. And I'll come back to the business problem in a minute. But on the government side, this idea that at best government is there to fix a market failure is, means that you're always kind of too little too late. You by definition have to wait for the market to fail to even do anything. Or if you want to do something before, you have to ask, oh, where's the market failure? And so to actually govern, this transformational change that we need in order to get more inclusive growth and more sustainable growth, I think we need a much more proactive approach for both innovation and competition policy in order to actually then govern that process, which is really much more about actively shaping and co-creating markets. But just one quick thing, it's not that the market failure approach should be thrown out, the baby with the bathwater. It's actually quite useful. It's very useful to justify certain types of policies. But the big point is, if you need structural change, if you need transformational change, you need more than that, not just market failure fixing. And we also, I think, need also new vocabulary. The fact that public goods are seen as a correction for something that the private sector is not doing means that, it's also harder to also galvanize the kind of solidarity in a moment like we have right now with COVID-19, where I think the concept of the common good would also be quite useful, but there's nothing really like the common good within economics. And the common good is really more about the objectives that we have, globally, not just something that's a correction, right? So transforming the public good from being a correction to being an objective also requires really rethinking some of the underlying theory, but also what it means for policy in terms of governing processes of innovation towards common good type results. And so what does a market shaping and market co-creating approach look like if the market fixing one is too narrow? And what I want to do, and this is very self-serving, very sorry, but I'm going to go through in a lightning round kind of way some key points in my last 3 books. But hey, that's what happens when you invite an academic to give a keynote. They talk to you about their books. But luckily, I've actually been working on this with policymakers worldwide. So that's really what I'll be reflecting on, the lessons on the ground what my institute calls practice-based theorizing. You know, it's not good enough just to go lecture the world to say, hey, this is a great idea. What does it actually look like on the ground when you realize that it's much harder than, say, just academics preaching about an idea? So really what I want to focus on is this idea that we need public sector investments to be more than just market fixing, to really be bold and to be strategic and to provide that patient long-term finance that can crowd in private sector investment. This is why we need an idea of public investment that's not just filling the gap, if there's a gap somewhere, but actually leading. And, you know, but that means not necessarily picking winners, picking one technology, one sector, and so on. We know that doesn't work, but it does really mean picking directions and then fostering that long-term patient, high-risk capital that often is not coming even in places like the VC sector, which tends to be quite risk-averse and coming in after those types of public investments. Then the problems that can arise if we don't be careful about value extraction and how do we govern a system where we're not just supposed to be sharing the risks, but also the rewards. So the second book I looked at, if we believe in collective value creation, what does it also mean in terms of sharing the rewards and the benefits from that value that's created across all different stakeholders? And this is where I'm quite critical sometimes of the stakeholder value approach, because I sometimes hear the same people talking about stakeholder value still then say things like, oh, and wealth is created in business, right? Wealth creation happens inside business, and we just have to make sure it's then redistributed to all sorts of different stakeholders. And I would say, oh, no, sorry, I disagree. You know, stakeholder value is about admitting that value is actually created collectively across lots of different actors. And that's why we also need to rethink our theories of value, but also, you know, concepts like pre-distribution instead of just redistribution, to make sure that all the different actors, whether it's workers, public organizations, and so on, are really getting their fair share of the deal ex ante, to make sure then that government doesn't have to waste so much time, again, redistributing processes that have become dysfunctional. And the third piece of work, which I'll probably focus most of my time on, a very little time, just 5 minutes, so this is going to be super whirlwind, is this concept of missions and purpose and really kind of directed growth, and an example of that. So I've actually already said everything I had to say. But anyway, you know, in the entrepreneurial state, what I argue is that if we did just have market fixing policies, we would not have had, you know, the internet revolution or any general purpose technology. Why? Because what that actually required was all sorts of different decentralized public investments across the entire innovation chain, not just basic research, also applied research, but also that patient long-term finance downstream, whether it's through public banks or the public venture capital fund of the CIA, which no one seems to know about. It's called InQtel, or YOSMA in Israel. That patient long-term finance has been essential in many different countries to allow startups to actually scale up. And yet we don't really understand these organizations. We don't understand how they're organized culturally, how they're organized in terms of their remits. We've just done a report, by the way, that came out this month on the BBC, which has been inside the UK innovation ecosystem, a very dynamic a public organization with an internal discussion about public value, which isn't really even shared within the UK in terms of what does that mean as a metric, producing public value within a public organization. Anyway, this decentralized network of different organizations are very important, not in terms of just filling gaps, but crowding in all sorts of other actors and ecosystems. The problem is when those organizations aren't actually doing their job and are just giving handouts and subsidies, as opposed to leading the way to crowd in other forms of actors, that of course does lead to all sorts of distortions. In my second book on value, what I focus on is we need to make sure then that we don't just get all this public money in the system, we need to govern that. So the US is a great example. You have $40 billion a year being put into the health innovation system, and then somehow we forget to make sure that the prices of the drugs, of the medicines, reflect that collective contribution, but also the intellectual property rights get abused. William Baumol talked about this. He talked about how patents are often producing unproductive entrepreneurship as opposed to productive entrepreneurship. Dick Nelson has written about it. So patents are often too upstream. We're actually patenting the tools for research. They're too wide, used for strategic reasons. They're too strong, hard to license. That's a bad deal. But, patents are contracts. The state gets something, the firm gets something, and unless you actually govern that process with public value metrics within, the state isn't actually getting a good deal from giving a 20-year monopoly to companies. But companies also don't get a good deal if these contracts aren't structured in such a way that really then fulfill catalyze long-term innovation, which benefit all of us. We have a new project, by the way, that's been looking at this concept of algorithmic rents. And so instead of just having this idea of break up big tech, how can we actually unpick what's happening with algorithms across different types of companies and really differentiate Schumpeterian versus Stiglitzian rents or Ricardian rents? And the idea that, I think I have some slides here just to show you quickly, that if you look at how Amazon, for example, how its search engine worked back in the day when, in its early days to how it works now, what you see that a lot of, and this is also true with Google, that whereas the algorithms initially were actually really helping a lot of the different suppliers go very high up on the search engine, in more recent years, almost all search items that come up right away are those that are actually sponsored, that have some sort of advertising revenue. So in terms of where the revenues for Amazon are coming from, they're increasingly, in fact, from marketing. And that, in theory, would be fine, except that the whole point of the search engine and how it also justifies its very large size in terms of the value that's created for society has to be brought back to what value is the consumer actually getting. And if the suppliers themselves are increasingly being manipulated, if you want, and not actually rising up on the search screen unless it's producing profits for Amazon, that itself needs to be questioned. So this notion of algorithmic rents to better understand value creation versus value extraction. And in that concept, it's also really interesting to ask, do we need new institutions? So it's really interesting how Barcelona in Spain, what they did was they actually the city mayor hired hackers to come into the city government. This is Ada Colau. To help the city actually have less intermediation between data when it's created and improvements to the needs, that citizens have. So a more direct relationship with data that's created, say, from Citymapper to improvements in public transport and also now public housing required actually a new sort of a digital commons that was created with specific people that were hired, new types of civil servants. And so this isn't just about regulating a process better, but what are the new institutions that we actually require to do that? And lastly, literally just 1 minute max, what I talk about in the recent book is that in order to do this, to have a more purpose-oriented system, so to admit that we need public investments, but also governing it for a purpose towards inclusion, towards sustainability, making sure we have value creation and not value extraction, it's quite useful to actually rethink the design of our policies, right? So instead of having, say, an industrial strategy that has a list of sectors, what does it mean to have very concrete goals like a plastic-free ocean globally, carbon neutral cities nationally, or at a city level, something like zero knife crime, if I think of the problems in my own city in London, and really devise our strategies from industrial strategy, procurement, and so on, to get as many different sectors involved. Just like going to the moon wasn't just about aeronautics, there was innovation and investment in nutrition and in textiles and materials and so on. And to crowd in, again, this concept of crowding in bottom-up experimentation. And I'm just going to skip ahead here. One of the very important things when you have a mission, though, is what does it mean, again, for how you structure finance, for also the dynamic capabilities within the public sector that you need precisely in order to design things like a procurement to really pick the willing and not just pick winners, concept I already talked about before. And the idea that business is talking about, this is my last slide, that business is talking about the need to have a more purpose-driven corporate governance is, I think, a really important moment, which is what does it mean to bring purpose and stakeholder value outside of the box just of corporate governance, but at the center of a system? What is a stakeholder value governance of an innovation system, which actually determines and helps us design a more functional, more value creative, less extractive relationship within a public-private partnership, so that ecosystems, a word that is often on the tip of every innovation policy guru's tongue, those ecosystems are actually more symbiotic and mutualistic and less parasitic if we think of what's gone wrong, for example, in the health sector. And this is, by the way, what got us to the moon. I'm done now with my time, but it's what people don't realize is just how much private sector innovation helped in terms of getting to the moon. It wasn't just NASA, but what NASA did was it took care about the contracts. And this is so important for competition policy. They had clauses like no excess profits. And they also made sure that the, I'm thinking of their collaboration with General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola. They also made sure that instead of using cost plus contracts, which were really easily gamed, they had fixed price contracts with incentives for innovation. So again, if we think today of the green economy, of the space economy, of the health economy, not only do we need to have kind of common missions in order actually to make sure that we're doing things that are needed in terms of tackling those SDGs, but we really need to pay a lot more attention than we have so far. The deal, the Green Deal, the partnership, and how do we measure a partnership that is in fact more symbiotic and mutualistic. I have more slides, but I've gone over time, so I'm going to stop sharing, which will force myself to shut up so I can actually answer some questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mariana. I think, you covered a lot of ground there. Clearly a big thinker at work there. So a lot of your work touching on so many fundamental issues. One of the things that has come up in the Q&A chat a couple of times, which is linked to this last point. So I think it might be best to just get that out of the way immediately, and then we will move into some other more competition-oriented questions, which are this criticism that a lot of your work doesn't focus enough on the role of the private sector. How do you respond to that? So you mentioned, there was this interlinkage with the private sector in the context of going to the moon. I mean, what are your thoughts on what the private sector has to play in this mission-oriented state of play? I mean,
in fact, my work is all about the private sector. So the fact that actually we often don't have enough private sector investment. If you look even at the UK where I live, for example, the average business investment is lower than OECD average, and this is true. I mean, by definition, if you have averages, some will be higher, some will be lower, but still in many countries, there's not enough private sector investment. So what does it mean to design policies that really catalyze private sector investment? In many countries, you have too much indirect incentives, which assume that a business already wants to invest, and you just need something like an R&D tax credit to make it invest. Unfortunately, that often doesn't lead to additionality, helping investment happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise if those indirect incentives aren't also accompanied by these more direct mission-oriented investments, which create new opportunities, which then increase the expectations of business of where those future opportunities lie. And, this is a huge issue right now where globally we have profits actually at a record level, the profit share of GDP, but investment is not. The labor share is at a record low level. So the problem is not profits, it's investment. And because we need a partnership, all those different problems that I mentioned, like the SDGs and what's underlying them, the state can't handle them alone. Business can't do them alone. What does it mean to really foster, again, a partnership between business and the public sector that is not only goal-oriented, but also that the public bit is tilting the playing field, not because it's, distorting the market, but it's really choosing a direction and then picking the willing, who's willing to help solve some really important problems. That's a very different type of scenario than the one that, for example, in Italy, where I'm from, not where I'm standing, but where I'm from, there's often this more parasitic kind of subsidies and guarantees and handout mentality. And COVID has been so interesting because some countries like France have actually put strong conditionalities attached to the recovery fund. So Air France and Renault had to lower their carbon emissions, at least commit to doing that in order to receive the recovery fund, whereas in the UK, EasyJet just got this big, bailout condition-free. So that issue of conditionality, putting it at the center and making it a positive word, which conditionality sometimes sounds a bit more punitive, but a positive word that really defines a more symbiosis partnership is really what I'm talking about. And it can't just be done by business. It can't just be done by the state. And my work is trying to think about how can we partner better together.
Okay, thanks, Mariana. I mean, linked to this, there's also an interesting question, which is, now getting more into the direct link with the competition authorities, let's say, in the competition policy. You mentioned conditionality just now in France, in the Air France scenario. So you have a lot of packages, rescue packages that are coming on stream, a lot of measures that governments are putting on stream for the economic recovery. And in your book, you talk a lot, and today you've mentioned, market shaping, the importance of market shaping. Does that, what role should competition authorities or can competition authorities play? So, states are together with private entities, as you've mentioned, moving towards creating new technologies, moving into new markets. And then presumably, it seems to me from reading your work and some of the words you said today, that you want to have competitive markets after that. So is there a role, do you see a role for competition authorities in helping governments design those policies?
They're essential. I mean, that's why I sort of began with Schumpeter, who said, this is actually about how we understand competition. I think what he didn't talk a lot about was the, final outcomes. Is this causing, climate change or not? That was less relevant, at least, or it was probably just as relevant. He just, it just wasn't in the, discussion yet. But so how do we shape markets to actually achieve what we, at least in democratically elected, societies where the people who govern the countries are democratically elected, and that they win ideally the election based on their vision for change, again, whether it's the Green Deal or something else, you then need a competition authority that also makes sure that we're moving towards kind of a better world than a worse world, because this isn't just about competition, the number of firms, for example, in a sector, it's also what are they actually doing. But this attention to value creation as a collective effort means, I think, that competition authorities should also have more of an eye on literally on the objective production structures. Who's doing what along a whole innovation chain, along the risk space? How are those rewards being shared, right? A lot of the reason why we have big tech today being, at a record level, if you want, in terms of income generation and size generation from that, is also because of how the value is being distributed. We can pretend it's just because, there's all this great kind of innovation happening and that's why they're growing more and more, but it's also about the capture of that value. So competition authorities being able to look both at that kind of division of innovative labor, who's doing what, but also who gets what, I think is one of the lenses that we don't necessarily have enough of. But also this issue of additionality, state aid rules, which, competition authorities are often the ones that have to then enforce. I don't think there's enough talk about why this isn't it's not about don't have a state-owned enterprise or a large public entity. It depends what it's doing, right? So if you're really creating additionality, if you're pushing the frontiers, if you're creating a kind of greener, more sustainable economy, or pushing the frontiers of technology, doing what's not being done and catalyzing, again, business innovation in directions that it otherwise would not go, that should be absolutely fine. Whether it's through a DARPA or a public bank or some innovation agency in a country, I don't think we have enough also common knowledge, if you want, amongst lay people, that the real problem is not a large public entity that can distort the market, it's what is it actually doing? And in Italy, where I'm from, we had a large state-owned enterprise called IRI, the Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana. It had 3 phases. One was public, but not politicized, attracting top managers, and they really, in some ways, fostered Italian industrialization, creating the motorway from north to south in just 4 years, something that today we still don't have. The motorway from Turin and Milan seemed to take 20 years. The second phase was public, not and super politicized. All the parties got their hands in, and it became also kind of a handout machine. And the third phase was privatized. In the second and third phase, so public but politicized and privatized, were equally failures. So what does it mean to create public and not politicized public entities within an innovation ecosystem that actually increase competition because they're having that catalytic role? We need much more attention to the characteristics of those public organizations, which we know are critical. The US entrepreneurial state, as I called it, absolutely depended on all those different public organizations. And yet, unfortunately, in many countries across Europe, I see this and I hear it all the time, they're almost fearful of creating kind of a DARPA type institution because they believe it'll go against state aid rules. And this is both a misunderstanding, but it's also a failure, I think, of competition commissions themselves to really kind of create a better story and framing so that we all understand what the objective is, which is, again, additionality, catalytic, ecosystems, which really drive change. And if you need a public entity to kind of, foster the early stage, high risk, patient public investment, which we know in the past has been required, that's fine, but certain strong criteria then need to be met. And it's not just about, distortionary policies because you have a large state-owned enterprise, for example.
Yes, I mean, to a significant extent, thanks, Mariana. I mean, to a significant extent, we're talking really about the importance also of corporate governance and how that can play and how important that will be in the current economic scenario, where you probably can envisage more and more governments entering into the equity of private entities going forward, I would imagine. So I think this is an interesting, let's say,
yeah,
point.
I think COVID has made that actually, I mean, the Financial Times has had at least 4 articles about, actually advocating that the state take on some equity stakes given the huge, amounts of public money that are going in. But there's no reason that you wouldn't have that even in normal times. When the US government after the financial crisis tried to direct the fiscal stimulus, which was 800 billion, in the green direction, they actually had a portfolio of investments in companies as different as Tesla and Solyndra. Solyndra went bust, the taxpayer picked up the bill. Tesla did well, oh, that's private enterprise. And Obama actually said to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, the government's gonna get 3 million shares in your company, which makes no sense. He should have said, if you do pay back the loan, which they did in 2013, we get 3 million shares in your company. The price per share went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round. So this kind of public venture capital fund kind of thinking for these downstream, kind of the company level investments is again, something that I think we need to at least consider and not see it as anti-competitive or, the big state, the Soviet state or something. This is actually about fostering more inclusive form of capitalism where we really are sharing both risks and rewards. But again, there too, you would want strict criteria of what actually then happens with that kind of public upside to make sure it doesn't lead to, another form, say, of rent seeking. But that's why the debate, should be had instead of just worrying about the state as a non-competitive actor if it does start taking stakes.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think we're over time, but I would like to ask you one last question if you still have. I know that.
Sure.
So maybe one last question for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll stop it there. But in your book, Mission Economy, when you reference the 7 principles, and you've mentioned this during your initial remarks, when you mentioned the 7 principles for a new political economy, you said that we need a better theory of competition to serve as a benchmark to measure real markets, which are nearly always incomplete and imperfect. And then you reference innovation, and you say that it should be at the center and how we think about competition. And you've mentioned innovation quite a bit in your talk and in your work. Do you see the role for competition and competition policy in the drive for innovation in the recovery policy? What can competition authorities, how can competition authority or competition policy more broadly contribute to this push towards innovation that will help us leave the economic recession and go into recovery?
I mean, so I think the answer is definitely yes, but the context is also a very interesting one where, for example, in Europe, after the financial crisis, the recovery was conditional on countries reducing their public debt, right? That was the whole kind of then rebellion of countries like Greece against that, and Italy as well. This time around, the conditions are investing and innovating and having a strategy for that around climate change and digitalization. And so this is, the opportunity actually, this kind of Marshall Plan type recovery, and it is quite a large pot of money, close to $1 trillion in terms of the EU Next Gen recovery. That's not going to be enough to just say invest in digitalization. We need to make sure that the results of that are actually leading to the kind of results we want. So if those contracts, if a country, in order to have its recovery fund pot, creates a big digitalization plan where then all the contracts go out to 1 or 2 incumbents, that's going to be a problem. But also if what those incumbents are doing are problematic practices or using algorithms in problematic ways, that's also part of the problem. So how do we both think of our objectives, just focusing there on that one, on digitalization of an economy? And by the way, digitalization of public administration is a huge challenge in so many countries globally, but also always have that idea of what are we actually trying to do? We're trying to create a more competitive ecosystem in terms of decreasing barriers to entry, yes, but we're also trying to make sure that consumers are actually benefiting from this great technology, but also all the suppliers across the value chain. I think that's where competition authorities are so important, which is how do we govern innovation and production to actually meet common good. I come back to that concept of the common good, which I think is something that's missing actually from our understanding of competition. It's not just a public good, the common good, and that requires more refinement, again, of how we do things, like something that I think every country is quite bad at in terms of national statistics, differentiating rents from profits. Rents from profits was a huge concern of Adam Smith, who called landlords thieves and called rent theft. That difference, unfortunately, within how we calculate GDP and national income accounting is not as refined as it used to be. And that's why I've been advocating that we need a more objective kind of, look, just like Adam Smith did with the pin factory, kind of who's doing what, where are they positioned, who's getting what, and what's the overall outcome. It would really serve, I think, to bring more analysis of production inside the competition authority. So competition isn't seen as something abstract, but it's actually then tied back to what are we actually producing, where's it going, who's getting the benefits, the kind of, who's doing what and why question. And there's no place like the digital, and platforms right now that really expose this, because otherwise you just get kind of silly policies like break up big tech without, so you just get lots of little rent-seeking actors. We need to put our attention at the level of the production, for example, how the algorithms are actually working and whether they are creating or extracting value.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariana. Excellent talk, and then Q&A. And I think you were, as we had hoped for, provocative, kind of shaking up a little bit the competition policy field as well, making us think out of the box, and also to try and see how we can apply and integrate some of the forward-thinking ideas that you've brought. I think it's probably difficult, and if you look at the Q&A box, there's some skepticism as to how, in particular regarding enforcement, how this can all then translate into the enforcement field. So we're probably more thinking about the lines. It's probably, the ideas probably have more receptivity, let's say, in the market shaping, in the advocacy part of the state interventions, the state support measures that you can see that we will talk about as well a bit.
By the way, Bell Labs, the reason Bell Labs exists or existed in its heyday, which is one of the most successful and innovative private sector R&D laboratories, was that the government forced AT&T, which had a monopoly, it's competition policy point, the monopoly, that in order to retain its monopoly status, they had to reinvest their profits back into the economy, back into innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. And that's another example of a healthy deal, right? This conditionality, we've done it in the past, we're doing it with COVID. How can we normalize this concept of actually having more, symbiosis and the partnerships, and how can competition policy officials and commissions become part of that process of thinking of, the design of a partnership to actually achieve a non-value extractive outcome?
Yes, definitely things that we need to continue to think about and develop further.
Thank you.
And I think you've kickstarted that debate. So thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you once again. It was really a great pleasure and honor to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.